Rain brushed softly against the glass walls of the 34th floor, turning the city lights below into a blur of gold and silver. Inside his corner office, Ethan Cole sat in silence. The hum of the skyline filled the room, but his eyes weren't on the numbers glowing across the laptop screen. They followed something else, or rather, someone. Every evening at exactly 7, Claire Bennett passed his door with a stack of reports in her arms, her hair slightly loose from the long day. She never noticed his gaze, or maybe she pretended not to. To her, he was just the CEO, distant, unreachable. To him, she was the only calm in the chaos he had built around himself. Ethan told himself it was admiration, respect, a harmless curiosity. But deep down, he knew the truth somewhere between late-night meetings and quiet mornings. He had started to wait for her footsteps. Outside, thunder rolled over San Francisco Bay. The lights flickered once, and for a fleeting second, he saw his reflection in the window, powerful. Yes, but achingly alone. That night, as the storm grew heavier, a single decision would change everything he thought he knew about control, connection, and what it really means to see someone. And it all began the moment he couldn't look away anymore. Rain whispered against the rooftop windows of the glass terrace, a restaurant perched above the glowing veins of San Francisco. From that height, the city looked like another universe, cars no bigger than sparks. People just shadows moving through the mist. Inside, the clinking of silver cutlery mingled with jazz playing low from hidden speakers. Every table shimmered beneath candlelight. At a corner table near the glass wall sat Ethan Cole. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie a quiet navy blue, the kind of detail no one noticed but him. A tablet rested before him, the glow of numbers reflecting in his eyes. But he wasn't reading. His gaze kept drifting, pulled by something softer than logic. Across the room, moving with quiet grace between crystal glasses and polished shoes, was Claire Bennett, a server who didn't quite fit the place. There was something calm in the way she carried a tray, something warm in the way she smiled at guests too busy to notice her. While others hurried, she listened when people spoke. She had that rare stillness that made noise around her fade. Ethan caught himself watching the way a loose strand of hair brushed her cheek as she leaned to pour wine. He looked away, almost embarrassed by his own attention. Ridiculous, he thought. CEOs didn't stare at waitresses in five-star restaurants. He reached for his glass of scotch, pretending to reread the quarterly report on the screen. But every reflection in the glass showed her silhouette moving behind him. A waiter stopped by. Another drink. "Mr. Cole?" "No, I'm fine," Ethan replied, his voice quieter than usual. He was tired of meetings, of faces that smiled because they had to, of conversations that ended in numbers. He used to paint once, years ago. Now his world was all contracts and deadlines. Yet tonight, something about that woman's steady movements brought back a memory. He didn't know he'd kept a memory of colors and peace. Outside, the rain thickened, sliding down the tall windows like silver strings. Claire appeared again, this time with a towel in her hand, drying the drops that leaked through a small crack near the frame. Her fingers moved gently, almost tenderly, as if she were caring for something alive. When their eyes met for the first time, it lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was long enough. Claire froze, startled to see him looking. She quickly turned away, murmuring an apology she didn't need to say. Ethan smiled faintly, unseen. There was a quiet honesty in her fluster that felt human. Moments later, a group of businessmen at a nearby table called her over, their laughter loud, edged with arrogance. One of them spilled his wine on purpose, joking about needing a beautiful rescue. Claire bent to clean it, keeping her voice polite, her eyes steady. Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to stand up, to say something, but he didn't. Years of discipline told him not to interfere. Still, the scene scratched at something deep inside him, a memory of being underestimated once, long ago, before he had built the armor of power. When the group finally left, Claire straightened, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced toward the window, catching her reflection hair out of place, blouse damp from the spill. She brushed it off, forced a smile, and went back to work. But Ethan saw the flicker of fatigue in her eyes. It wasn't just a long shift. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from holding everything together. He stayed long after most guests had gone. The staff dimmed the lights. The jazz turned softer, and rain kept tapping like fingers on glass. Claire began collecting empty glasses near his table. "You don't have to rush," Ethan said quietly. She looked up, startled again. "Oh, thank you, sir. I'm just closing up." Her voice was gentle, professional, but tired around the edges. He hesitated, unsure why he was even speaking. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost a year," she said. "Nights mostly." He nodded, pretending the question had been casual. "You must see all kinds of people." She gave a small smile. "People look different after a few drinks, but they all want the same thing, someone to listen." Her answer caught him off guard. It wasn't what most would say. She finished stacking the glasses, then turned toward the bar. Ethan watched her go, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table, an old habit when his mind wandered. Through the window, the storm was easing. A faint trail of moonlight cut through the clouds, glinting against the wet rooftops below. Claire moved through that silver glow, unaware that the man in the corner had forgotten his own reflection to watch hers. In another life, maybe he would have walked up to her, asked about the rain, or the music, or the faint scent of coffee she carried. But in this life, he only watched, and wondered why it suddenly felt like something inside him had cracked open just enough for the night air to slip in. When she disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan gathered his things. The restaurant felt emptier without her presence. He left a quiet tip larger than he meant to, and a small note on the napkin. "Thank you for the calm." He doubted she'd even see it. As he stepped into the elevator, the city lights reflected off the rain, still clinging to his coat. Down below, traffic murmured like the ocean. He should have felt powerful, but all he felt was distance between the life he had built and the one moment that had made him feel alive again. Back inside. Claire found the napkin. She read the words and smiled faintly, though she didn't know who had left them. Outside, thunder rolled one last time before fading into silence. Neither of them knew it yet, but something had shifted. A single look across a crowded room had set two very different worlds on a quiet collision course, one that neither power nor caution could stop. The rain had softened into a mist by the time Claire reached the Mission District. The streets shimmered under dim yellow lamps, reflecting puddles that trembled with each passing car. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric damp and smelling faintly of coffee and detergent. In her hands, a small paper bag soup from the diner where she worked mornings, still warm against the chill of night. Her apartment sat above an old piano shop that hadn't sold a single instrument in years. The sign outside was faded, letters missing, but inside, the place still breathed music. When she opened the door, the faint scent of varnish and dust greeted her, mixed with something softer, the quiet hum of a radio playing jazz from another room. "Dad," she called gently. From the small bedroom came a familiar cough, then the creak of the old bed frame. "You're home, sweetheart," a voice answered, rough but warm. She set down the bag and hurried to him. The lamp by his bedside threw a soft golden glow over a man whose body had grown fragile, but whose eyes still carried the same spark that had once filled downtown sidewalks with melodies. Walter Bennett, former street musician, lover of old songs and stubborn dreams. Claire brushed the back of her hand over his forehead. "You're warm again." "It's just the blanket," he murmured, smiling. "Don't fuss." "I always fuss." She laughed softly, tucking the quilt around him. "Dinner's here, tomato soup and a little bread. Not fancy, but hot." He watched her as she poured the soup into a chipped bowl, her movements careful and practiced. "You've been working too much," he said. "That restaurant keeps you late. And the diner in the mornings. When do you even rest on the bus?" she teased, setting the tray by his side. 5 minutes here and there. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "You sound like me at 20. I guess the apple doesn't fall far. They ate quietly, the only sound the rain tapping against the window, and a piano melody floating faintly through the floorboards below, an old recording that played on repeat. Walter hummed along, missing a few notes but smiling anyway. Afterward, Claire washed the dishes in the tiny sink, the warm water fogging up the glass nearby. Her reflection looked tired, but there was a softness in her eyes, a kind of quiet endurance that kept her moving. When the plates were dry, she wiped her hands on a towel and turned toward the corner of the room where a small easel waited, half hidden behind a curtain. The canvas there was blank, except for faint pencil marks, sketches of a face she couldn't quite stop remembering. Dark eyes, calm and unreadable. The man from the restaurant. She hesitated, fingers brushing the edge of the brush. She told herself it was just a study practice, nothing more. But when the brush touched the paint, her hand didn't listen to logic. Stroke by stroke, Ethan's features began to form in the dim light. The curve of his jaw, the stillness of his mouth, the gaze that had met hers for that brief, suspended moment. She didn't even notice her father watching from the doorway until he spoke. "Who's that?" Startled, she turned. No one, just someone from work. Walter smiled knowingly. "Someone you look at the way you used to look at sunsets." Claire laughed, flustered. "You're imagining things." "Maybe," he said softly, turning back toward his room. "But don't forget, I've played enough love songs to recognize the first note." When he disappeared down the hall, she stood there a long while, brush still in hand. The room was quiet except for the hum of the city below, the low rumble of buses, a dog barking, distant laughter spilling from a bar 2 streets away. She looked back at the canvas. The paint was still wet, the colors blending like fog meeting light. Something about it felt wrong, too intimate. She almost wiped it clean, but instead, she turned it toward the wall. Some things were easier to hide than to erase. Later, she sat by the window, a mug of tea between her palms. Across the street, the bakery's sign flickered half-lit words reading, "Fresh daily," even though it hadn't opened in months. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Claire thought of the note she'd found at work, a small napkin with neat handwriting. "Thank you for the calm." She hadn't known who left it, but the words had stayed with her all evening, like a faint melody she couldn't stop humming. "Thank you for the calm," she whispered to herself, tracing the rim of her cup. No one had said something like that to her in a long time. Most people didn't notice calm, they noticed mistakes. The clock struck midnight. She rose, checked on her father once more, then dimmed the lights. Before slipping into bed, she paused by the easel again. One corner of the canvas caught the glow from the streetlight, revealing just enough of the painted eyes to make her heart tighten. Maybe tomorrow she'd paint something else, something easier. But tonight, she let the silence fill the room. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a faint trail of steam rising from the pavement. The city slept, but inside that small apartment above the piano shop, a quiet rhythm continued a daughter's steady breath, a father's soft snore, and a heart beginning to stir for reasons it didn't yet understand. And somewhere, far across the city, a man in a glass tower looked out over the same misty skyline, feeling that something in his world had shifted too, though he couldn't yet name what it was. The city outside was half asleep when Claire woke again. A gust of wind rattled the window frame, and for a moment she thought it was morning, but the clock on the wall glowed 2:17. The apartment was silent except for the faint hiss of the radiator and her father's breathing from the next room. She sat up, unable to shake the image that had followed her into every dream since that night, the still gaze of the man at the corner table. She didn't even know his name. She'd told herself he was just another guest, a face she'd forget by sunrise. But here she was, wide awake, her fingers tingling like they needed to touch a brush. She slipped from bed, careful not to wake her father, and crossed the small living room. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and old books. On the easel, the canvas she'd turned to the wall waited, blank except for the ghost of a sketch she'd started days before. Claire stood for a while, listening to the quiet. The urge to paint rose like a tide she couldn't hold back. She reached for the lamp, turning it low so the light barely reached the edges of the room. Then she began to paint, not from memory exactly, but from feeling. The first strokes were hesitant, unsure, as if she feared naming what had been nameless until now. But soon her hand found rhythm. The tip of the brush slid through the paint, capturing shadows before color. She started with the outline of his face, the quiet line of a jaw seen only in reflection, the slope of his nose beneath the golden restaurant light. Then came the eyes. She hesitated there, brush hovering. Those eyes weren't just dark, they held something deeper, a mix of distance and weight, like he carried a room full of unspoken words behind them. She tried to paint that, the silence of it, the kind of gaze that saw everything and gave nothing away. Outside. A car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. She barely noticed. The world had narrowed to the canvas and the soft rasp of bristles meeting linen. Every movement felt like confession. And when she finally stepped back, her breath caught. The man staring back at her wasn't a stranger anymore. She set the brush down slowly, palms trembling. For a second, she wanted to laugh at herself. This was absurd. Painting the face of someone she didn't know, someone she might never see again. But there was something magnetic about that realization, too. It was as if her heart had recognized something her mind refused to name. The kettle clicked off behind her, startling her from the thought. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling like breath in the cold air. Sitting by the window, she studied the painting from across the room. In the soft light, the man's expression shifted with every flicker of the street lamp outside, tender one moment, distant the next. She wondered what kind of life could shape a look like that. Her father coughed, breaking the spell. She rose, checked on him, adjusted the blanket. When she returned, she found herself speaking softly to the painting, as if to justify what she'd done. "It's not you," she whispered. "It's just what you left in my mind." The words sounded foolish even to her ears, yet strangely comforting. Hours slipped by, unnoticed. The tea grew cold, the candle burned low. Outside, the fog rolled in from the bay, thick and silver. Claire drew her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them, eyes never leaving the painting. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, curiosity not born from survival, but from wonder, the kind that came before love, before fear, a fragile, dangerous spark, just before dawn. She rose and covered the canvas with a thin white sheet. She wasn't ready for her father to see it or for herself to admit what it meant. She whispered a small prayer, not quite knowing to whom, that the feeling would fade by morning. But even as she crawled back under the blanket, she knew it wouldn't. The image had already carved itself into her, the way music lingers after the last note fades. When sunlight finally seeped through the curtains, it painted soft gold across the edge of the easel. The sheet over the canvas fluttered slightly in the breeze, like it might breathe. Claire turned on her side, eyes half open, pretending to sleep. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew that a quiet line had been crossed in the night. A line between memory and longing, between chance and choice, and far away. In a glass-walled office overlooking the same waking city, a man paused in the middle of reading a report, his thoughts drifting, uninvited, to a woman in a green apron who had smiled at him once through candlelight. He didn't know why she came to mind just then, but when he looked at the window, his reflection seemed to hold a question he could no longer ignore. The day had begun, but something inside both of them was still caught in the soft pulse of that unfinished night. The following Thursday, the evening light spilled gold through the tall glass windows of the glass terrace. Outside, fog curled low over the bay like soft breath on glass. Inside, the city hummed quietly beneath the sound of jazz and clinking silverware. Claire adjusted the collar of her uniform as she arranged wine glasses on the table near the window, the same table he'd sat at last week. She didn't notice him at first. Ethan Cole had a way of appearing without noise, as if the air itself shifted to make room for him. He was early half an hour before the dinner crowd, a small difference that changed everything. "Good evening, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice calm, but edged with that quiet confidence that made people straighten when he spoke. She looked up, startled, recognizing the same man whose face she'd painted under moonlight. "You remember my name? It's my job to notice details," he said. Then, after a pause, though not always the right ones, she smiled lightly, unsure if it was a joke. "Would you like your usual table?" "Actually," he said, glancing toward the corner, "I was wondering if you'd join me, just for a moment. Dinner? Maybe." Claire froze. Her first instinct was to laugh, to assume he was being polite in a way rich men sometimes were more for curiosity than company. But his eyes held no arrogance, just a strange sincerity that made her pulse quicken. "I'm still on shift," she managed to say, half apologetic. "I already spoke to the manager," Ethan replied gently. "He said you could take a short break." It was so unexpected that she could only nod. "All right then, just a few minutes." She followed him to the window table. The city below stretched in rippling lights, and for a while, neither spoke. Claire smoothed the napkin in her lap, suddenly aware of every movement, every sound, the rain beginning to patter again outside, the low hum of conversation behind them. Ethan broke the silence first. "I was told this restaurant used to be an artist's studio before it became what it is now. Can you imagine that?" She blinked at him, surprised. "Really, I didn't know." He nodded. "A painter lived here. He painted the city from this very spot. The view was his muse, I suppose. Now it's all corporate dinners and imported wine." Something in his tone carried regret more than criticism. Claire tilted her head. Maybe that's just how life changes. Dreams find different shapes. He studied her face for a moment. "You sound like someone who knows about dreams." Her lips curved. "Don't we all?" He smiled at that. The waiter came and poured them water, discreet and silent, then disappeared. The two of them sat like strangers at the edge of a fragile bridge, one built out of curiosity, not yet trust. "So," she said after a pause, "what did you dream of, Mr. Cole?" "Before all this," she gestured vaguely toward his expensive suit, the skyline behind him. He looked out the window, his expression softening. "Believe it or not, I used to paint. I wanted to travel, fill sketchbooks with cities I'd never see twice. But then my father passed, and I took over the company. Responsibility has a way of dulling color." Claire's breath caught. "You painted for a while." His gaze returned to her. "Not like you think just enough to know what it feels like to lose hours chasing the right shade of light." The words felt too close, almost personal. Claire lowered her eyes, tracing the rim of her glass. "I used to draw, still do. When there's time. When there's time." He echoed quietly, as though testing the sound of it. "Do you ever show anyone?" She shook her head. "No, it's not good enough." He leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the table. "Who told you that?" Claire hesitated. "No one needed to. Life has a way of reminding you where you belong." Ethan studied her then, really studied her. There was no self-pity in her voice, only quiet acceptance, the kind that came from years of holding steady against things she couldn't change. "I don't think you believe that," he said finally. Her eyes met his, startled by the certainty in his tone. "And why is that?" "Because people who give up don't sound like you," he said. "They don't look at the world the way you just did, like it still owes them something beautiful." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the bay. Claire felt the words settle in her chest, warm and heavy. She wasn't sure what to say. The waiter returned with their meals, 2 simple plates, salmon and vegetables, but neither seemed hungry. Claire tasted one bite, mostly to distract herself. "Maybe," she said softly, "we all just end up painting in different ways. You build companies, I serve wine. Maybe that's art too, in its own strange way. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe, but I think some people are meant to bring color back into places that have forgotten it. The way he said it made her heart stumble. She wasn't sure if he meant her or something else entirely. The rain thickened outside, sliding in lines down the glass, catching bits of city light in its path. Time blurred. Their conversation drifted from art to music, from childhood to what kept them awake at night. She told him about her father, about growing up listening to street musicians in the Mission. He listened without interrupting, his usual control softened by something like wonder, and somewhere between laughter and silence, between the sound of rain and the glimmer of the skyline, they began to forget where they were, two strangers finding echoes of themselves in each other's unfinished dreams. When the clock near the bar struck 9, Claire stood reluctantly. "I should get back." Ethan rose, too. "Thank you for joining me." His voice was low, genuine. She smiled, gathering her tray. "Thank you for remembering I exist." He almost replied, but the words caught somewhere between his throat and heart. She was already walking away. From his seat, he watched her slip behind the counter again, her figure moving through the soft haze of candlelight. Something in him felt lighter and heavier all at once. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. He stayed until the room emptied, until only her reflection remained faintly in the glass before him. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole realized he didn't want the night to end. The week unfolded like a quiet echo of that dinner, unspoken glances, brief nods, and a soft current neither of them dared to name. Ethan found himself returning to the glass terrace more often than reason could justify, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for the illusion of work, but mostly for the few minutes he could watch her move through the glow of candlelight, calm and unhurried, while the rest of the world spun too fast. One night, he arrived later than usual. The crowd had thinned, and the rain outside had turned into a steady curtain of silver. Claire was wiping down tables, her hair tied loosely, the fabric of her uniform damp at the shoulders. There was something tender in the way she moved, like she was carrying the whole day gently, afraid to wake whatever peace she had left. Ethan stood by the bar, watching her without meaning to. When she looked up, their eyes met just long enough for both to feel the space between them shift again. He cleared his throat, pretending to check his watch. "You're closing tonight," she smiled faintly. "Always. I get the late shifts, fewer customers, more time to think." He hesitated, the question forming before he could stop it. "Do you have far to go?" "About 40 minutes on the bus, sometimes an hour if it rains." He frowned. At this hour, she shrugged. "I've learned the quiet buses are the safest ones." The sentence shouldn't have bothered him as much as it did, but something in her calm acceptance hit deeper than expected. He pulled his coat tighter. "I can give you a ride?" Claire froze for a moment, unsure if she'd heard him right. "That's kind, but no, it's really fine." "Claire," he said softly, the sound of her name surprising even himself. "Please, it's late. Let me drive you." There was no demand in his voice, only a quiet insistence that made it hard to refuse. After a moment, she nodded. "All right, just this once." Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. His car waited at the curb, black and gleaming, windows misted from the cold. She stepped in carefully, sitting upright, hands folded in her lap, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. The city lights blurred past the window, streaks of amber and blue. Ethan glanced sideways at her reflection in the glass. She looked small against the leather seat, eyes half lost in thought. "You don't have to be nervous," he said quietly. "I'm not," she replied. "Just not used to this kind of silence." He smiled. "I'm told it's my best quality." Her laugh was soft, almost surprised. The sound filled the car like something fragile and real. For a while, they spoke of small things: music, the restaurant, how she once burned an entire batch of muffins and still sold them to tourists because they looked homemade. Ethan found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. But as the buildings grew older, the streets narrower, His amusement faded into quiet concern. Streetlights flickered, graffiti covered the walls, and potholes broke the rhythm of the tires. Claire's hand gripped her bag a little tighter. "Almost there," she murmured, as if to reassure him. When she finally told him to stop, they were in front of a narrow building above a shuttered piano shop. The faded sign read, "Waltz Instruments." A single window glowed faintly upstairs. "This is home?" he asked, his voice softer than before. She nodded. "For now. It's just me and my dad. The owner's a friend. He lets us stay cheap." Ethan looked at the cracked sidewalk, the peeling paint on the doorway, the rusted drainpipe dripping rain. Something inside him tightened. For a man who owned towers of glass, this sight felt like another planet. "You live above a piano shop?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled, half wistful. "Used to be one. You can still hear the ghosts of old songs if you listen hard enough." He didn't know how to answer. She reached for the door handle, breaking the moment. "Thank you for the ride." "Really?" "Claire," he said again, almost stopping her. "If you ever need anything, I'll manage," she interrupted gently. "I always do." He wanted to argue, but the calm certainty in her voice silenced him. She gave him one last grateful smile, then stepped into the drizzle, her footsteps echoing against the wet pavement as she climbed the narrow stairway. The light in the upstairs window flickered, then steadied. Ethan stayed in the car a long time, the engine idling softly. He looked up at the window again, imagining her inside checking on her father, maybe setting down her bag, maybe standing by the same canvas that still held his unfinished reflection. He rested his hand on the steering wheel, staring at the raindrops collecting on the glass. The world he'd built, the luxury, the control, the precision suddenly felt too clean, too quiet. Here, everything was cracked and imperfect, but alive. He should have driven away. Instead, he turned off the engine and sat there until the rain began again. Heavier this time. In the rhythmic sound of it, he heard something unfamiliar, the weight of wanting to understand someone else's life without knowing how to belong in it. When he finally drove off, the streets shimmered like a memory fading in the rearview mirror. Claire's window was still glowing, a small square of light in the gray. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't want to return to the view from the 34th floor. He wanted to remember this one, the quiet street, the old piano shop, and the woman whose world made his suddenly feel too large and too empty. The morning light crept through thin curtains, painting the walls of Claire's small apartment in soft gold. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving behind a hush that made every sound seem fragile, the ticking clock, her father's slow breathing, the faint hum of the city waking up. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee absently, eyes distant. Sleep had been elusive. Her mind kept replaying the night before the ride, the silence, the way Ethan had looked at her street without a word. It was the kind of look that lingered, half curiosity, half something else she couldn't name. The phone rang suddenly, slicing through the quiet. Claire jumped, spilling a few drops of coffee on the table. She grabbed the receiver, expecting another bill collector or one of her freelance clients asking for revisions. "Hello, good morning, Miss Bennett. This is Laura from Mr. Cole's office." Her heart skipped. "Mr. Cole." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Cole asked me to reach out regarding a commission. He'd like to discuss a possible art project with you." Claire blinked, convinced she'd misheard. "A project?" "Yes," the woman continued, professional and calm. "Cole Industries is opening a new corporate building downtown next season. Mr. Cole is curating original artwork for the main lobby. He specifically requested you. 10 large-scale pieces." Claire froze. Her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles turned white. "I think there must be a mistake," she whispered. "I'm not a professional artist." "Mr. Cole was quite clear." The assistant replied, "He said you would understand. If you're available, we can schedule a meeting tomorrow to go over the details." The line went quiet, waiting. Claire swallowed hard. "Yes, of course. I'll be there." When the call ended, she just sat there for a moment, staring at the phone like it had turned into something unreal. Then she laughed soft, disbelieving. Her father stirred in the next room. What's funny, Walter's voice was groggy, still half asleep. She turned toward him, eyes wide. Dad, he wants me to paint. Ethan Cole, 10 paintings, for his company. Walter blinked, confused. Ethan Cole, the man who drove you home? She nodded, unable to stop smiling and trembling all at once. Yes, that one. Her father's eyebrows lifted. You sure it's not charity? The question hit her harder than she expected. She looked down at her hands. I don't know. Maybe. But even if it is, it's still a chance. And I need to take it. He watched her for a long time before nodding. Then take it. But make sure you're doing it for you, not for him. The next morning, Claire stood outside the glass tower of Cole Industries, her reflection caught between steel and sky. She felt impossibly small in her second-hand blazer, clutching a portfolio under her arm. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Every surface gleamed. A receptionist smiled and guided her to the elevator, where she rode in silence, her pulse loud in her ears. When the doors opened, Ethan was waiting. No assistants this time, no staff, just him in a charcoal suit, sleeves rolled up slightly, as if he'd been working. His expression softened when he saw her. Claire? You came? I wasn't sure it was real until I got here, she admitted. He smiled faintly. I promise. It's real. He gestured for her to follow. Let me show you something. They walked down a corridor of glass until they reached a wide, sunlit room overlooking the bay. Bare walls stretched high above them, pale and endless, like untouched canvas. This is where they'll go, Ethan said quietly. 10 pieces. I could have hired a dozen established artists, but none of them would see this space the way you might. She turned slowly, taking in the light, the height, the sound of the waves faintly below. Why me, she asked. You've met real artists, people with degrees and studios. Ethan looked at her, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he said, because you see people the way most artists see color, that's rare. The room fell silent. She felt the weight of his words settle between them, delicate and dangerous. I can't accept something like this, she said finally. It's too much. It's work, he replied simply. You'll be paid like any artist. No favors, no conditions. Claire studied him, searching for any trace of pity, but all she saw was patience, maybe belief, the kind she hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a long time. She took a deep breath. All right, I'll do it. He nodded once, almost relieved. Good. You'll have full creative freedom. We'll handle logistics canvas, materials, whatever you need. When she left the building later, the contract papers tucked under her arm, the world outside looked different. The same streets, the same fog rolling over the bay, but everything seemed a little brighter, like she'd stepped into a painting still half finished. That night, she set up her easel again, the same one that had leaned against the wall for years, gathering dust between shifts. As she mixed her paints, she thought of Ethan's words. You see people the way most artists see color. Maybe he was wrong, or maybe he wasn't. Her father watched quietly from his chair, smiling as he saw the light return to her eyes. Looks like you've got work to do, he said. Claire dipped her brush into the first stroke of blue. Yes, she whispered. For once, I really do. Outside. The fog lifted for a moment, revealing the glimmer of the city's towers. Cold glass catching the first glow of moonlight. Somewhere high above, in one of those buildings, Ethan Cole stood by his window, phone in hand, reading her signed acceptance email. He exhaled, slow and quiet, then turned toward the city lights. It wasn't just business anymore. He knew that now. And though he couldn't quite name it, something about this felt like the beginning of a change he wasn't ready for, but couldn't walk away from either. The decision came quietly, like most turning points do not in thunder or revelation. but in the stillness between two breaths. Claire sat at the kitchen table that night, her father's old blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The papers from Coal Industries lay open in front of her, the ink gleaming faintly under the yellow light. 10 paintings. A real commission, real money, a future she hadn't dared to imagine since her mother's passing, since the years had taught her to trade dreams for bills and midnight shifts. Walter was sitting by the window, his guitar resting on his knees. His fingers traced the strings without pressing them, as if remembering how the notes used to sound. He looked up at her, eyes gentle but alert. "You've been staring at those pages for an hour," he said softly. "I'm trying to make sure it's not a mistake," she replied. "That maybe they'll realize they sent this to the wrong person and take it back." He smiled, a little crookedly. "People don't offer 10 paintings by mistake, sweetheart." She sighed, rubbing her temple. "It's just, what if it's not about my work? What if it's just his way of helping out of pity?" Walter strummed a low, quiet chord. "And if it is, does that make the paint less real, the work less yours?" Claire looked up, surprised. "Sometimes," he said, "help isn't about who deserves it. It's about what you do with it." His words lingered in the air like the faint hum of an old melody. Claire turned back to the papers, tracing the company letterhead with her finger. The thought of quitting the restaurant made her chest tighten. She'd been there long enough to know the smell of every tablecloth, the rhythm of every shift. The work was hard, but familiar and safe. Art, though, art was a cliff. She wasn't sure she could step off without breaking. She stood and crossed the room to her easel. The half-finished painting of Ethan still leaned against the wall, his painted eyes meeting hers in silence. "I don't even know what he sees in me," she murmured. Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe it's what you see in yourself," and just forgot. The next morning, the world seemed too bright. Claire walked to the restaurant with her resignation letter folded neatly in her pocket. Her steps felt heavier than usual, her heart loud in her chest. She'd written and rewritten the note 3 times before deciding that simple words were best. "Thank you for everything. It's time for me to follow another path." Inside, the familiar sounds greeted her, the hiss of espresso, the clatter of plates, the murmur of polite conversations. Maria, her co-worker, waved from the counter. "You're early today. Big day." Claire smiled faintly. Something like that. She waited until the manager appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. When she handed him the envelope, his brow furrowed. "You're leaving?" "Yes." Her voice wavered, but she held his gaze. "I've been offered an art commission. It's something I can't turn down." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll miss you here, Claire, but I think this place was always too small for you." His words caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Thank you," she whispered. When her shift ended, she stood at the door one last time, looking out at the fog curling down Market Street. For years, this had been the view between her and survival. Now, for the first time, it looked like the edge of something new. That evening, she told Ethan her decision in a short call. He was quiet for a long moment before replying. "You're sure?" "Yes." "I'll make the arrangements," he said. "You'll need a proper studio." "I'll have my team." "No," she interrupted gently. "No teams, just space." "I'll find my way." He hesitated, then said, "Fair enough. But if you need anything, call me." After the call, she sat on the floor by the window, letting the city's hum fill the silence. She could feel fear curling somewhere deep inside her chest, but it didn't scare her as much as it used to. Maybe because this fear was alive, it meant she was finally moving again. Walter watched from his chair, smiling quietly. "You know," he said, "the hardest part about chasing a dream isn't the leap. It's letting go of the ground." Claire looked at him, eyes glistening. "What if I fall?" He shrugged. "Then you paint from where you land." She laughed through the tears, and in that small sound, the heaviness lifted. That night, she packed her apron and name tag into a box and set it by the door. Then she stood before her canvas again, the one that had started it all. She reached out, tracing the faint brushstrokes of Ethan's painted face. It felt like touching a memory and a promise at once. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, like applause from the sky. She took a deep breath, dipped her brush into a pool of color, and let it touch the canvas. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't painting to escape. She was painting to begin. And as dawn crept over the rooftops, turning the city pale blue, she whispered to the quiet room, "All right, life. Let's see what you've got." The light caught the edge of her painting, the wet paint gleaming faintly like hope reborn. The first morning in the studio felt like waking into a dream she had once painted and forgotten. The space smelled faintly of wood and sunlight, of something unfinished but alive. It was tucked at the far end of an old industrial district near the bay where warehouses had long fallen silent, and the only sounds left were the cries of distant gulls and the rhythm of the tide. The floorboards creaked under her steps, and the high windows spilled in soft, endless light. Claire stood in the center of the empty room, a box of brushes in one hand, her sketchbook in the other. She turned slowly, taking in every corner. The walls were bare, cracked in places, but beautiful in their honesty. She could see dust floating in the light, tiny sparks dancing in the air, as if the room itself was breathing with her. She hadn't expected Ethan to find a space like this. She'd imagined something polished and sterile, a place that looked like success but smelled like emptiness. Instead, this felt human, like it was waiting for her to make it her own. On the first day, she worked until her hands trembled. The sound of the brush against canvas was the only thing that existed. Hours passed, unnoticed. When she finally stepped back, sunlight had turned to amber, the light catching flecks of paint on her cheek. Ethan appeared that evening, almost quietly, as if not to disturb the air. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee and stood at the door for a moment before speaking. "I thought you might need this." Claire turned, smiling despite the exhaustion on her face. "You didn't have to come. I wanted to see the space," he said simply, handing her the cup. "And make sure you didn't fall asleep standing up." She laughed softly. "Not yet. But ask me again in an hour." They stood side by side, watching the bay through the windows. The sun dipped low, scattering gold across the water. The moment stretched, comfortable and quiet. Ethan broke it first. "You've done a lot in one day." She looked at the canvas strokes of blue and gray, forming the vague outline of a city at dawn. "It doesn't feel like work," she said. "It feels like remembering." He studied her profile, the way her eyes softened when she spoke. "You really love it," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't know if it's love," she replied. "It's more like breathing after holding my breath too long." Ethan nodded slowly. He wanted to tell her something, how seeing her here, surrounded by color and light, made him remember his own forgotten pieces. But he didn't. Instead, he walked around the studio, tracing his hand along a wooden beam. "You know," he said, "when I was a kid, I thought being successful meant having everything new. Turns out, it's the old places that make you feel alive." Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe because they've survived." He looked at her then, a quiet recognition passing between them. Days slipped into a rhythm neither of them defined. Claire painted from morning until dusk, her hands often stained with paint, her hair always coming loose. Ethan stopped by now and then, sometimes to bring supplies, sometimes just to talk. Their conversations drifted between work and silence, the kind of silence that spoke without demanding answers. One afternoon, she caught him watching her. She was bent over a sketch, sunlight falling across her face. What she asked, without looking up? "Nothing," he said, "just wondering how someone can make stillness look so alive." She laughed quietly. "You're terrible at flattery." "Good," he said, "because it wasn't." The words hung in the air, soft, but certain. Claire felt a warmth rise to her cheeks, and for a moment, she didn't trust herself to look at him. She turned back to the canvas, pretending to mix colors, but her heart wasn't fooled. Ethan stayed longer that day. They shared takeout from the diner down the street, sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall. He asked about her father, about her life before the restaurant, and listened without interruption. When she spoke about her mother's old paintings, the ones she'd had to sell years ago, he didn't offer comfort or advice, just silence, the good kind. By the time he left, the bay had turned silver under the moonlight. He paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "You're building something beautiful here, Claire. Don't doubt that." She watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet street. Then she turned back to her easel, eyes tracing the unfinished lines of her painting. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, looking out at the rows of dark warehouses and the faint lights of the city beyond. The air smelled of salt and rain. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what was coming next. Still, there was something new stirring beneath the calm, something fragile, like a melody she almost recognized but couldn't name. The next morning, when the first light spilled through the tall windows again, Claire stood in the center of the studio and closed her eyes. The world felt vast and quiet. She picked up her brush, dipped it into the paint, and smiled. Outside, the bay shimmered in the morning light, and somewhere across town, Ethan Cole opened his email to find a single message from her, a photograph of her first finished piece. No words, just color. And for the first time in a long while, he understood what it meant to feel alive simply by looking. The invitation came in a white envelope with embossed gold letters, so unlike anything Claire had ever held. It arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked beneath a bouquet of lilies left at the studio door. She almost didn't open it, thinking it had been delivered to the wrong place. But inside, written in Ethan's steady handwriting, was a single line. "Join me this Saturday, the Winter Charity Gala. I'd like you to see a world that should see you too, for 2 days." She tried to convince herself not to go. Events like that weren't her world. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, whispered deals over champagne. She'd spent years serving people in rooms like those, not standing beside them. But when Saturday came, and her father smiled from his chair, saying, "You'll regret it if you don't," she found herself slipping into the one dress she owned that wasn't for work. It was a deep shade of midnight blue, simple, soft at the neckline. She borrowed a pair of earrings from her neighbor and tied her hair loosely, letting a few strands fall free. When Ethan's car stopped in front of the building, she almost didn't step out. But then he appeared, black suit, tie undone just enough to look human. His eyes softened when he saw her. "You look perfect," he said quietly. She laughed nervously. "Perfect's a big word. Let's stick with presentable." But his gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, the rest of the world felt a little quieter. The gala was held at the Fairmont, in a ballroom draped in gold and candlelight. Strings of lights floated above the crowd like fireflies. The air was thick with perfume, soft laughter, and the sound of violin blending into the rhythm of footsteps. Ethan guided her through the crowd, his hand resting lightly at her back, not possessive, but steady. Everywhere she looked, people turned to greet him, CEOs, art collectors, board members. They spoke his name with respect that bordered on reverence. Yet tonight, he seemed less the man who ruled boardrooms and more the man who stood a little closer than he needed to. "This feels like another planet," she whispered as they stopped near the gallery wing, where paintings lined the walls beneath warm light. "Then, let me be your translator," he said softly. He introduced her to everyone as an artist. The words felt too big, too heavy, yet they rolled from his tongue as if it had always been true. She shook hands, smiled politely, tried to remember names, but all she could think about was the way he kept glancing her way, as if to make sure she was still breathing. At one point, they stopped before a large abstract painting, streaks of crimson and gold sweeping across black. "What do you see?" he asked her. Claire tilted her head. It looks like chaos trying to remember what peace felt like. Ethan smiled. That's what I thought too. Their eyes met in the reflection of the glass frame, and neither looked away. As the night went on, she began to relax. A few people asked about her work, others complimented her dress. The orchestra shifted to a slower tune, a waltz that rippled through the room like soft rain. Ethan turned to her, his voice low enough that she barely heard over the music. "Dance with me, I can't," she said quickly. "I'll embarrass both of us. I'll take that risk." Before she could protest again, his hand found hers, warm and certain. He led her to the edge of the dance floor, where the light dimmed and the world seemed to move slower. She hesitated at first, awkward in her steps, but he guided her gently, his palm steady against the small of her back. "See?" he murmured. "You're fine." She looked up at him, trying to find something to say, but words had stopped making sense. The violin swelled, golden and tender, and the space between them narrowed until she could feel his breath near her cheek. Time stretched, the crowd blurred. It wasn't planned. Neither of them knew who moved first, but somewhere between one heartbeat and the next. His lips found hers. It was soft at first, hesitant, the kind of kiss that asks permission rather than assumes it. But then the hesitation melted into something deeper, something they both had been avoiding since the moment they met. When they finally pulled apart, the music had already shifted to another song. Claire's pulse echoed in her ears. She looked at him, eyes wide, searching for words. But Ethan only whispered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." She shook her head gently. "Don't." The air between them trembled. For a moment, neither spoke. They both knew what had just happened. Wasn't simple. It wasn't just attraction or impulse. It was crossing a line neither of them had drawn, but both had felt. Someone nearby called Ethan's name. The spell broke. He stepped back, composed again, the CEO returning to his rightful armor. "I'll get us some air," he said softly. She nodded, turning toward the balcony while he slipped away. The night air was cool against her flush skin. From the terrace, she could see the city stretching out in lights and shadows, 1,000 lives moving below. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still warm, still trembling. Inside, laughter rose again, the music swelling, but out here, everything was still. Claire leaned against the railing, her heart caught between wonder and warning. She knew what had begun, and that ballroom wasn't safe. Not for her, not for him. Yet, even knowing that, she couldn't bring herself to wish it undone. Behind her, the door opened softly. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her silhouette against the city lights. Then, quietly, he said, "This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," she whispered, and still, neither of them moved away. The morning after the gala, the world felt strangely distant, like a song playing from another room. Claire woke with the faint taste of champagne still on her lips, and a memory she couldn't stop touching in her mind, the warmth of his hand, the quiet tremor of that first kiss. For hours, she painted without pause, as if the colors could help her make sense of what had happened. By noon, her studio smelled of oil and turpentine, sunlight spilling through the tall windows. She was halfway through sketching the outline of a woman's face, half in light, half in shadow, when a knock came at the door. It wasn't Ethan. Standing there was a woman in her late 40s, elegant in that effortless way that spoke of old money and inherited grace. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her eyes calm but observant. Claire felt herself straighten instinctively, wiping her hands on a paint rag. "Claire Bennett," the woman asked. "Yes," Claire replied, uncertain. The woman stepped forward and extended a hand. "I'm Lauren Cole, Ethan's sister." The words landed softly, but something behind them felt sharp. Claire hesitated before shaking her hand. "Oh, I didn't know he had a sister. Most people don't," Lauren said with a faint smile. "He prefers it that way." She glanced around the studio, her gaze drifting over the canvases. the sketches pinned to the walls. He's been talking about this place. You've made it quite beautiful. Thank you, Claire said carefully, unsure why her pulse was quickening. Lauren's eyes softened. I didn't come here to intrude. I came because I've seen this before. Claire frowned slightly. Seen what Lauren took a slow breath, choosing her words. Ethan's generosity. His fascination with people who remind him of something he's lost. He finds someone, usually a woman, talented, passionate, and he helps her rise. He gives her space, opportunity, attention, and for a while, it's magic. But it never lasts. The words hung in the air, heavy as dust. Claire crossed her arms, as if to steady herself. I think you might be mistaken. This is just a commission, a professional project. Lauren tilted her head gently. Is that what last night was? Professional? The silence that followed felt like a blade's edge. Claire's throat tightened. She looked away, her voice quiet. Whatever happened last night, it wasn't planned. It never is. Lauren said softly. She reached into her purse and took out a small folder. I'm not here to embarrass you. Claire, I just want you to see what he doesn't show anyone. Inside were printed articles, photographs, press pieces, charity newsletters, art programs, each one with a different woman's name beneath a sculptor from Portland, a pianist from Chicago, a photographer from Los Angeles. Each story told a similar arc. Ethan Cole, the patron who discovered and supported them, who funded their work, who eventually stepped away to focus on his company. Claire's stomach tightened as she flipped through the pages. You're saying he abandoned them? Lauren's tone stayed calm, almost tender. I'm saying he saves people because he doesn't know how to save himself. But when they start to believe in him too much, he runs. He doesn't mean harm. He just doesn't stay. Claire felt her pulse in her ears. She wanted to defend him, to say he wasn't like that anymore, that what she and Ethan had was different, but her throat closed around the words. The images blurred. Lauren's gaze softened. You seem kind, Claire, strong. I don't want you to become another chapter in his guilt. Why are you telling me this? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Because, Lauren said, you're the first one I think he might actually love, and that means you're the one who could hurt the most. The words landed like a quiet storm. Claire looked down, her hands still holding the folder. For a moment, she could hear nothing but the faint cry of gulls outside, the wind moving softly through the broken window pane. I should go, Lauren said finally. I've said what I needed to say. What you do with it, that's up to you. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she paused, glancing back at one of the canvases, an unfinished painting of Ethan's reflection in glass. He looks at the world like it's something he has to fix, she said softly. Maybe he just doesn't know how to let it love him back. Then she was gone. The door closed with a quiet click, and the studio fell into silence. Claire stood there for a long time, the folder still open in her hands, the pages trembling slightly. The light had shifted now, thin and gray, cutting through the window in sharp angles. She set the folder down on her work table and stared at it. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to believe none of it mattered. But another part, older, quieter, knew the ache of disappointment too well to ignore the warning. When the phone rang later that afternoon, she let it ring 3 times before answering. Ethan's voice was warm, familiar. Claire, I was hoping to stop by tonight. Maybe take you to dinner. There's a new place near the bay, she interrupted gently. Ethan, can we talk tomorrow? A pause. Of course. Is something wrong? No, she said, too quickly. Just a long day? He hesitated, then said softly, all right. Tomorrow, then. After the call ended, Claire sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. She looked around the studio, the light, the color, the pieces of herself spread across every canvas. For the first time, it all felt fragile. Outside, the fog rolled in from the water, blurring the edges of the world. Claire reached for her brush but couldn't lift it. Instead, she whispered into the still air, as if to no one, What if she's right? The question hung there, unanswered, dissolving into the sound of the wind and the soft creak of the old walls. And somewhere across the city, Ethan sat by his window, wondering why her silence suddenly felt like the beginning of a storm. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of gray San Francisco morning that never really turns into day. Claire had been painting since dawn, her mind still tangled in Lauren's words, when her phone buzzed on the table. She almost didn't answer until she saw the name. It was the nurse from the clinic. Her voice was calm, but Claire could hear the urgency beneath it. "Miss Bennett, your father's condition has changed. He's been admitted to the hospital. You should come now." Everything after that became a blur, the rush to grab her coat, the sound of her shoes against wet pavement, the endless red lights that wouldn't change fast enough. By the time she reached the hospital, her heart felt raw from holding itself together. She found her father in room 207. The white sheets, the steady rhythm of the monitor, the faint smell of antiseptic, it all felt too familiar. He looked small against the bed, paler than she remembered. When he opened his eyes, he smiled weakly. "Hey, kiddo. Don't look so worried." Claire tried to smile back, but her voice caught, "You scared me. Dad, they just want to keep me a few days. Something about my heart being tired of pretending it's 25. But as she held his hand, she could feel the tremor beneath his skin, the quiet struggle of every breath. The doctor arrived not long after, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a clipboard full of unwelcome news. "He'll need a minor procedure," he said, "and some monitoring. We can manage it, but it won't be cheap." The number he mentioned pressed against her chest like a weight. Claire nodded quietly, thanked him, and stepped out into the hallway. She sat on one of the plastic chairs, hands shaking. Her phone vibrated again, Ethan's name lighting up the screen. She almost ignored it, then sighed and answered. "Claire, I've been calling. What's wrong?" His voice was soft, worried. She closed her eyes. "It's my dad. He's in the hospital. They said he needs surgery." A pause. Then, steady and certain. "I'll take care of it." Her stomach tightened. "No. Ethan, don't argue. You shouldn't have to worry about money right now. I'll call the billing department and..." "Stop." Her voice cracked, sharper than she meant. "You can't just fix everything with a phone call." "I'm not fixing," he said, quieter now. "I'm helping." Claire stood, pacing the hall. "You don't understand? This is exactly what your sister warned me about. You swoop in, you rescue, and then you disappear." The silence on the other end deepened. "Lauren came to see you," he said finally. "She did," Claire whispered. "And maybe she's right. She's not." His tone hardened, though there was hurt beneath it. "She doesn't know you, or me. This isn't about control, Claire. It's about care. But that's the problem," she said. "I can't tell the difference anymore." A long pause. "Do you really think I'm like that?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, just quiet, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. Claire pressed her forehead to the wall, tears threatening to break. "I don't know. Ethan, I want to believe you. But every time I start to, something reminds me I might just be another project to you." He exhaled, a slow sound that almost trembled. "You're not. You never were." "Then let me handle this," she said softly. "Let me do it my way. You don't have to prove anything." "Yes, I do." Her voice rose before she could stop it, drawing a glance from a passing nurse. She turned away, lowering her tone. "All my life, I've had to find a way through things on my own. If I let you pay for this, if I let you save him, then what am I to you? Someone you had to rescue to feel needed. Claire." "I can't," she said, shaking her head though he couldn't see. "Not like this." The silence that followed felt heavier than anger. "All right," Ethan said finally, his voice distant. "If that's what you want. But if something happens, I'll call," she whispered. She didn't hang up right away. Neither did he. They just stayed there, two people on opposite ends of a line, both too proud and too wounded to find the right words. When the call finally ended, Claire stood for a long time, staring at the sterile wall. Then she took a deep breath and walked back into her father's room. Walter was half asleep, his breathing steadier now. She sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the fragile rhythm of life beneath her fingers. "You okay, sweetheart?" he murmured without opening his eyes. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm okay." But she wasn't. Inside, everything felt split wide open: the fear for her father, the guilt of refusing help, the echo of Ethan's voice saying her name like it was something worth holding on to. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the hospital window. The city lights blurred into the mist, streaks of gold and gray. Claire rested her head on the side of the bed, eyes closing against the weight of it all. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, how to pay the bills, how to mend the crack that had formed between them. But as her father's breathing evened beside her, she whispered to the dark, "Please, just let him stay." The only answer was the steady beep of the heart monitor, the sound of love and time, fragile and fierce, beating on. And somewhere across town, in an office lit by cold light, Ethan sat alone, phone still in his hand, wondering when trying to care had begun to feel like breaking something sacred. The hospital lights never dimmed, not even at night. They hummed softly above Claire's head as she sat beside her father, the contract folder lying unopened on her lap. The sound of machines blended with the rhythm of her thoughts, measured, tired, unending. Walter was asleep, his hand resting in hers, fingers warm but fragile. She had promised herself she wouldn't let pride hurt him, but she also couldn't let love, any kind of love, turn into a debt she'd never finish paying. So, she found a way to make it right. The next morning, she walked into Coal Industries, the air-conditioned silence swallowing her footsteps. She waited outside Ethan's office, heart steady but guarded. When his assistant finally opened the door, she stepped in. Ethan looked up from his desk, startled. Claire? He hadn't seen her in days. The dark circles beneath his eyes said more than his words ever could. "How's your father?" "He's stable," she said quietly. "They'll do the procedure tomorrow." He nodded, relief flickering through his face. "Good. I've already spoken to the hospital. The bills will." She interrupted softly. "That's why I'm here." Ethan paused. The tone of her voice calm, deliberate, made him set down his pen. "Go on." She placed a manila folder on the desk. "This is a legal agreement." "My attorney helped draft it last night." He frowned, opening it slowly. Inside were neatly typed pages, her signature already at the bottom. She spoke before he could. "It states that you'll cover my father's medical expenses in full. In return, I'll complete the art commission as originally planned. 10 pieces, delivered by the end of the quarter. Once it's done, I'll reimburse you with a percentage of my sales from future exhibitions." Ethan looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, this isn't necessary." "It is," she said, steady, "because if I let you do this without boundaries, I'll never know whether it's kindness or control, and I can't live with that question." He closed the folder, fingers pressing against the paper like he was holding something fragile. "You think I'm trying to control you?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "No, I think you're trying to save me. But sometimes, saving someone also takes away their choice." Silence stretched between them, long and heavy. Outside the window, the city shimmered in gray light towers rising through fog like ghosts of certainty. Finally, he nodded. "All right, if this is what you need, I'll sign." She exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening just enough for air. "Thank you." He picked up his pen, hesitated once more, and then signed at the bottom. The sound of the ink scratching across paper felt final, almost like an ending neither had prepared for. When it was done, she gathered the documents, placed them back in the folder, and stood. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Until the project is finished, I think we should keep things professional." His gaze lifted sharply. I mean, she said, her voice barely holding steady. "No dinners, no calls that aren't about work, just the paintings, just what we agreed." For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. If that's what you want? It's what I need, she whispered. He smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't follow. Then you'll have it. Claire left the building with the same quiet grace she had entered. Outside, the afternoon air felt different, colder, sharper. She walked until the city noise blurred, until the ache inside her chest softened into something she could bear. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm between them changed. They met only for updates. Conversations were polite, clipped, careful. Ethan would stop by the studio, sometimes with his assistant, to review progress. Their exchanges were measured talk of lighting, deadlines, materials, nothing more. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that broke through. A brushstroke she caught him staring at too long, the way his hand lingered on the frame of a painting before he turned away, the soft hesitation before he said goodbye. Those moments were harder than distance. They reminded her of what they were both trying to forget. At night, when the studio went quiet and her father's room light flickered faintly through the video call on her phone, Claire would sit before the half-finished canvases and wonder if she'd done the right thing. She told herself this was strength, but sometimes strength felt a lot like loneliness. One evening, as she cleaned her brushes, she found a small note tucked under a set of paints. It was written in Ethan's handwriting, just one sentence: I'll keep my distance. But I won't stop believing in you. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it and slipped it into her sketchbook, where she kept unfinished drawings. The next morning, she went back to work. Outside, winter rain began to fall against the studio windows, steady and unending. Inside, she painted not from memory, not from pain, but from something quieter: acceptance. The colors shifted, less blue, more gold. The brush moved differently now, slower, more certain. It was as if she was painting her way through grief, one layer at a time, and though she didn't know it yet, every stroke was leading her towards something she couldn't yet name, something waiting at the edge of the silence between them. The unveiling took place on a Thursday morning, beneath the tall glass atrium of Coal Industries' new headquarters. The air smelled faintly of polished marble and new beginnings. Reporters filled the lobby, their cameras flashing under the cold glow of the skylight. 10 paintings lined the walls, each one Claire's radiant with color and restraint. Fragments of the city seen through her quiet soul. She stood off to the side, near the edge of the crowd. Her name echoed through the microphones, followed by applause. Someone called her the rising voice of contemporary realism. Someone else called her a revelation. She smiled when she had to, nodded when people reached for her hand, but her chest felt strangely hollow, as if her ribs were too wide for her heart. Ethan was there too, of course. He stood beside the mayor, saying all the right words, his voice even and composed. But when the ribbon was cut and the crowd surged forward, he avoided her gaze. It had been 3 months since their agreement, 3 months since the contract had drawn its thin, invisible line between them. He had kept his word. They had spoken only through assistance and email, their messages brief and precise. And now that it was over, now that every promise had been kept, she realized that success could feel a lot like silence. After the ceremony, journalists crowded around her. Flashbulbs burst. Claire. How does it feel to have your work displayed in one of San Francisco's most important buildings? She gave the answer they wanted. It's an honor. I hope the paintings bring a little light to people who pass through these halls. They smiled, scribbled notes, moved on. When the last question ended and the applause faded, Claire slipped away to the far end of the gallery, where her favorite piece hung. It was the smallest painting in the collection, a quiet portrait of the city at dawn, its buildings still half asleep, their reflection soft on the bay. In the lower corner, almost invisible unless you looked closely, was the outline of a man's figure walking alone across the pier. She stood there for a long time, until the crowd behind her began to blur into noise. Beautiful, isn't it? A voice said beside her. She turned. Lauren stood there, elegant as always, holding a glass of champagne. Yes, Claire said. It is. Lauren looked at the painting thoughtfully. You captured him. You know. Claire blinked. Who? The loneliness, Lauren said quietly. You made it honest. For once. There was no edge in her tone, no warning, only recognition. Then she set her glass down, nodded once, and walked away. When the room emptied and the lights dimmed, Ethan approached at last. The footsteps were enough to make her turn. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. You did it, he said softly. They're magnificent. Thank you, she replied, her voice even. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers who remembered being something else. I wasn't sure you'd come today, she admitted. It's my building, he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. And your art makes it worth standing in. The silence between them grew heavy, full of everything neither dared to say. Claire looked down, twisting her hands slightly. So, this is the end, I guess. The project's finished, the contract fulfilled. Ethan nodded. Yes, you've kept every promise. So have you? He studied her for a long moment, as if memorizing the quiet lines of her face. You'll have offers now, he said finally. Galleries, exhibitions. You don't need me anymore. That was the point, she said gently. He hesitated. Was it? Something in his voice made her look up, but before she could answer, someone called his name from across the hall. He turned, gave a polite wave, then looked back at her once more. Take care of yourself. Claire, you too, Ethan. He left without looking back. That night, she returned to her studio. The applause, the lights, the praise, it all seemed far away now. The space smelled of turpentine again, the way it had in the beginning. Her father was recovering well, sleeping at home, the worst finally behind them. Yet, for reasons she couldn't name, she felt lonelier than she had in years. She sat before a blank canvas, brush in hand, but nothing came. Her fingers trembled slightly, the silence pressing too close. She picked up the newspaper someone had left at her door. The headline read, Claire Bennett, the artist who brought humanity to steel and glass. She smiled faintly. Humanity. She wondered if they'd still call it that, if they knew how much of hers she'd poured into those walls. Across the city, in his high-rise office, Ethan sat before a window overlooking the skyline. The paintings were visible from where he stood, color-cutting through the glass reflection. His assistant had left hours ago, but he hadn't moved. He hadn't called. He told himself it was for the best. That distance was what she wanted, what she needed. Yet every time the elevator doors opened downstairs and he heard footsteps in the lobby, some quiet, foolish part of him hoped it was her. He'd seen her smile at the event, graceful and composed. She was everything he'd known she could be. And for the first time in his life, achievement tasted like ash. Back in the studio, Claire finally rose from her chair. She walked to the window, watching the city lights shimmer through a thin mist. Somewhere out there, she knew, he was doing the same. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass, feeling the coolness of the night seep through her skin. Thank you, she whispered to him, to the silence, to the version of herself she had become. Then she turned back to the canvas, picked up her brush, and began again, not for a contract, not for survival, not even for love, just to remember who she was when no one was watching. The first stroke landed softly, a pale streak of color across the white. It wasn't a beginning, it wasn't an ending, it was something quieter, something waiting. The call came on a quiet evening, the kind of calm that feels borrowed from a slower world. Claire sat by the window of her studio, her phone resting in her palm, the city outside glowing in soft, tired light. She had been staring at the number for nearly half an hour before pressing call. When Ethan answered, his voice was low, careful, like he already knew this wasn't a conversation about art. Claire. She closed her eyes for a moment, finding steadiness in her breath. Hi, I didn't wake you, did I? No, he said. I wasn't sleeping. There was a pause, the kind that stretched like a bridge between two people who had run out of small talk. She looked out at the skyline, at the slow drift of fog curling between the buildings, and spoke softly. I wanted to say thank you for everything you did, for believing in me. He exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to thank me. I do, she said, because I don't think I ever did it properly. Silence again, the kind that holds more than words. Finally, she continued, Ethan, I think we need some time apart. The words hung in the air, gentle but irreversible. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his tone was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. Time apart, he repeated. For how long I don't know, she said. Maybe a year. He let out a quiet laugh, not bitter, just tired. A year's a long time. I know, she whispered, but I need it. I need to find out who I am when I'm not standing in your light. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. Everything that's happened, my art, the gallery, the press, it's all tangled up with you. And I need to untangle it before I can know what's real. I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own, without your hand always there to steady me. Ethan was quiet for so long, she thought the line had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. I understand, she swallowed. Do you? I do, he said, and I hate that I do, but you're right. You deserve space to grow without wondering who's helping you bloom. The words caught in her chest. This isn't goodbye, she said quickly, almost pleading. It's just distance. For now. He gave a faint, almost broken laugh. Distance is its own kind of goodbye. Claire, her eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. Then I'll hope it's a kind one. They said little after that. Just soft good nights, the kind that linger on the tongue after the call ends. When she set the phone down, her hand shook. The silence in the room felt heavier than before, but not cruel. It was the kind that asked for courage, not comfort. The next morning, a letter arrived, handwritten. No logo, no envelope lined in gold, just plain white paper folded with care. Her name was written across the front in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Inside, the words were few, written in ink that had smudged slightly, as if he'd paused too long between lines. Claire, you're right. We both need space, yours to grow, mine to learn how to let go without closing my heart. For all the things I couldn't say, thank you for reminding me what it feels like to see the world with color again. Whatever happens a year from now, I'll be here, believing in the person you'll become, for your freedom, and for my faith in it. Ethan, at the bottom, in his usual shorthand, he'd written just 3 words, for your freedom. She traced the letters with her fingertips, a small ache curling behind her ribs. Then she folded the paper carefully and slipped it between the pages of her sketchbook, the same one where his earlier note still rested, yellowed at the edges. That night, she painted, not because she had to, but because the quiet asked for it. The canvas filled slowly layers of gray, a wash of white, the faint silhouette of 2 figures walking in opposite directions on a fog-covered pier. When she stepped back, she realized what she'd painted wasn't sadness. It was distance. Yes, but distance filled with light. Across the city, Ethan stood at his office window again, the skyline stretching before him in gold and blue. The same painting of hers hung on the wall behind him, one she had given him long before things became complicated. He turned to look at it, running a hand along the frame. I'll wait, he said quietly, to no one but the night. And outside, the fog rolled over the bay, soft and slow, carrying with it a kind of peace that only comes when 2 people finally stop holding on and start learning to trust what might return when the time is right. In her studio, Claire put down the brush, exhaled, and whispered, "Good night, Ethan." It wasn't the end. It was the breath before something new. The gallery smelled faintly of fresh paint and soft cedar, the scent of new beginnings. Evening light filtered through the tall windows of the Presidio Art Center, spilling across rows of canvases lined in quiet symmetry. Claire stood near the center, her hands loosely clasped, watching the guests drift between her work. A year had passed since she last heard his voice. A year of silence, of distance, of learning how to live without waiting. She had filled that year with color. Her art had changed bolder strokes, freer lines, a depth that came not from sadness, but from understanding. The critics called it mature. She called it honest. As the night settled deeper into its rhythm, music murmurs, glasses clinking, she felt calm. Not triumphant, not anxious, just calm. And then she saw him. He stood by the far wall, half-shadowed beneath the soft light, wearing no suit this time, just a simple charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked different, lighter somehow. The sharp edges, she remembered the CEO's posture. The commanding tone had softened. There was still strength in his stance, but it was quieter now, contained. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile he gave at public events, but the small, hesitant one she remembered from late nights at the studio. The one that said, "I see you." Her breath caught, but she returned the smile, a little unsure, a little tender. The crowd between them seemed to blur, their laughter fading into a hum. He crossed the room slowly, not wanting to startle the fragile peace between them. When he reached her, he stopped at arm's length. "Hi, Claire." She nodded, her voice soft. "Hi, Ethan." They stood there, both searching for words that wouldn't ruin the moment. "You cut your hair," he said finally. She laughed lightly. "And you stopped wearing ties." "Yeah," he said, smiling faintly. "Turns out, life's easier when you can breathe, for a heartbeat." They were quiet again, the air between them full but not heavy. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. He looked at her, painting the centerpiece of the show, a vast seascape, silver waves stretching toward a horizon that glowed faintly gold. "I promised myself I would," he said. "You once told me art is about showing up for what matters, even when it hurts." She tilted her head slightly. "You remembered that I remembered everything," he said. A slow warmth spread through her chest, not the rush of old feelings, but something steadier, grounded. She realized she wasn't trembling. She wasn't afraid of what this meant anymore. He turned back to the canvas. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "There's peace in it." "There had to be," she said quietly. "I spent a long time trying to paint forgiveness. For both of us?" He looked at her, eyes soft but unreadable. "Did you find it?" She thought for a moment. "I think I found acceptance first. Forgiveness just came with it." The music in the background shifted something gentle on piano, the kind that filled the air like memory. Around them, people spoke in low tones, but neither paid attention. Ethan gestured toward the painting again. "This one feels like closure." She smiled, a little wistful. Maybe it's just the beginning of something new." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant for a moment. "You've changed," he said softly. "So have you." "I had to," he admitted. "I spent that year trying to figure out who I was when I wasn't fixing things. Turns out, I wasn't very good at it." She smiled. "We're all learning." He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "I wrote something, not a letter this time, just a thought." She unfolded it carefully. Inside, just one sentence. "Sometimes love isn't holding on. It's stepping back far enough to see someone clearly." Her throat tightened. She looked up at him, eyes shining in the dim light. "That's beautiful?" He shrugged lightly. "I had a good teacher." They both smiled, genuine, unforced. For a while, they walked together through the exhibit. He listened as she talked about her work, her travels, the community projects she'd started with other local artists. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice, didn't try to shape her world. He simply listened, and she realized that was new, that was different. When the night drew to a close and the guests began to leave, Claire stepped outside for air. The bay stretched below, dark and calm beneath the city lights. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of eucalyptus and salt. Ethan joined her after a moment, standing beside her, but not too close. "The city hasn't changed," he said softly. "Maybe it has," she replied. "Maybe we just see it differently now." He smiled. "You might be right." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, just the quiet sound of the waves against the rocks below. Finally, Claire turned to him. "Thank you for coming." "Ethan," he met her eyes. "Thank you for letting me." It wasn't a reunion, it wasn't a rekindling, it was something gentler, a recognition that what they'd shared had shaped them both, but didn't have to define them anymore. As he left, she watched him disappear into the soft San Francisco fog, his figure fading but not lost. She turned back toward the gallery lights, her heart full but light. Inside, one last guest stood before her seascape. A young woman whispered to her friend, "It feels like the tide is about to turn." Claire smiled to herself. Maybe it already has. And as the night deepened, she knew that whatever came next, love, distance, or something in between, it would begin from a place of quiet strength, the kind that only comes when two souls finally learn how to stand on their own, side by side with the past, and unafraid of what tomorrow might bring. The morning of the opening arrived soft and golden. The fog had lifted early, leaving the bay shimmering beneath a pale sun. Wind brushed through the eucalyptus trees, carrying the scent of salt and paint, two things that now define the rhythm of Claire's days. The Walter Bennett Arts Center stood at the edge of the Presidio, where the city met the sea. Its walls were glass and cedar, filled with light. Children's laughter drifted from the courtyard, where brushes clinked against jars of water. Inside, the air hummed with quiet joy. Claire stood near the entrance, her hands folded loosely, watching the last of the volunteers hang a banner that read, "For those who see beauty where others forget to look." Her father had written the line months earlier, his handwriting still wobbly but certain. He was there now. Mr. Walter Bennett, seated near the small stage, his fingers resting gently on the worn keys of his old piano. His hair was silver, his eyes bright with the kind of peace that comes only after a long journey back to life. Ethan stood beside him, helping adjust the microphone cables. No suit, no tie, just the same quiet grace he had carried since the night they met again. When he looked up, his gaze met Claire's across the room. They didn't need words. The understanding between them had grown past speech. 6 months had passed since their reunion at the Presidio. It's 6 months of rebuilding, slowly and deliberately, not as savior and saved, not as benefactor and artist, but as two souls walking side by side. He had offered to fund the center's foundation, not as a gesture of penance or pride, but as partnership. She had accepted not as debt, but as trust. Together, they had turned a forgotten warehouse into a place of warmth and creation, a space where children from the city's quieter corners could paint, learn, and find their own voices. Now. As the first guests arrived, Claire felt her heartbeat slow. She had stood in galleries, on stages, beneath spotlights before, but this was different. This wasn't about recognition. It was about belonging. The ceremony began simply. No speeches filled with grandeur, no promises gilded in applause. Just stories, small ones told by people who had helped, painted, built. When her name was called, Claire stepped forward, her father's music softly following her. She looked out at the crowd artists, neighbors, children holding brushes too big for their hands, and spoke with a quiet steadiness. "This center began as a wish," she said, "a wish that art could heal what life sometimes forgets to mend. My father taught me that beauty isn't always in what we create. It's in the courage to keep creating, even when the world feels too heavy." Her voice trembled just once, but Ethan's gaze anchored her. She smiled faintly. "Today, I want to thank someone who reminded me that kindness doesn't have to come with condition, and that love, when it's true, asks for nothing but growth." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening with quiet emotion. She turned toward him and added softly, "This place exists because we both learned how to let go and how to begin again. The audience rose in applause, but she barely heard it. Her eyes were on her father now, who nodded gently, his hand hovering above the keys. Then, as the noise softened, Walter began to play. The first notes drifted through the hall low, tender, a melody that carried both ache and forgiveness. It was the song he used to play for her as a child, back when their world was small but full. Claire closed her eyes, the sound filling her chest like breath. When she opened them again, Ethan was beside her. He took her hand not to claim it, but to hold it with the care of someone who understood how fragile joy could be. The applause dimmed around them, the music swelling higher, and then, in that simple, unhurried moment, he turned to her and whispered, "Claire Bennett, will you marry me?" It wasn't planned, it wasn't staged. It felt as natural as the sunlight spilling across the floor. Her laughter broke through the stillness, soft, astonished, beautiful. "Yes," she said, almost in disbelief. "Yes, I will." The room erupted in warmth, clapping, laughter, tears. Walter smiled through his playing, his eyes glistening as he shifted into a brighter melody, one full of light. Ethan slipped the ring gently onto her finger, but the gesture felt secondary to everything else that filled the air. The gratitude, the love, the quiet recognition of how far they had come. Later, when the guests had gone and the children's voices had faded, Claire stepped outside. The sky was painted in the soft colors of dusk lavender and gold melting into the water. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the sea, behind her, through the glass walls. She could see Ethan talking with her father. They laughed at something, easy and unguarded. She breathed deeply, the cool wind brushing her cheek. There was no longer the ache of uncertainty, no weight of proving herself, only the calm truth that some stories don't end, they simply grow quieter, deeper, more real. When Ethan joined her, he slipped an arm gently around her shoulders. "You did it," he murmured. She leaned into him, smiling. "No," she said softly. "We did it, for a long time." They stood there in silence, watching the horizon fade into night. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "He's playing our song." Ethan smiled. He always was. The piano notes drifted through the open door, warm, unhurried, alive. Claire closed her eyes and let the sound carry her, the ocean breeze threading through her hair, her heartbeat steady beneath his hand. It felt like peace, the kind that doesn't need an ending, only light, only home. Sometimes, life's most beautiful turns come not from holding on, but from learning when to release. Ethan and Claire's story reminds us that love isn't about saving someone. It's about seeing them, truly, and giving them the space to become who they're meant to be. In a world that often measures worth by success or power, their journey teaches the quiet strength of humility, patience, and trust. For many of us, there comes a moment when we must let go of control over our children, our partners, even our own past, and trust that what we've nurtured will grow on its own. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. Because sometimes, love asks us to step back, so both hearts can breathe and find their way back freely. And when that happens, when forgiveness replaces pride, when understanding replaces fear, we rediscover what truly matters, not perfection, but connection, not achievement, but grace. It's never too late to begin again, to open our hands and hearts, and allow life to surprise us with gentleness once more. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending your precious time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of love, forgiveness, or the quiet beauty of second chances, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing gentle, heartfelt stories to life stories that remind us all that it's never too late to feel, to heal, and to begin again. Until our next story, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep your light shining.